hypothetical scenario. Imagine that you are, I don't know, at work maybe, or you are at a family get-together, and somebody who doesn't believe in Jesus is there, and you're talking, and that person says to you, well, why do you believe in Jesus? I mean, why do you claim to be a Christian, a follower of Jesus? What would you say? What would your reasons be? What would your set of, here's why I believe in Jesus points be? You ever think about that? It's good to think about it because it probably will come up at some time or another. You might be sitting on an airplane. I mean, I've had that happen before. And I'll never forget a situation that happened to me. It was great. I loved it. I was on a plane from John Wayne Airport in Orange County, California, to, I don't remember where, Chicago or Dallas, I guess, I forget. And because I do a lot of flying, they bump you up. They give you the free upgrades and such. So it's an early morning flight, like a 6:30 a.m. flight. And I walk onto the plane, and to my left, where the first class cabin is, where they bumped me up to, I could see that it was mostly empty, which is unusual nowadays. Most of the time it's jammed full. But this particular morning, it was mostly empty. And I saw that my seat was an aisle seat, row 4C or whatever. And I go to sit down there, and I realize that there's a fella sitting in the window seat in the same aisle as me, so right next to me, to my left. And most of the other seats were empty. So I sat down, and this guy was Middle Eastern, and he was reading a book or something. So I sat down. I said, good morning. He said, good morning. I said, it looks as though it's going to be a fairly empty cabin here. So once they shut the door, I don't mind moving to give you a little extra elbow room. And he looked at me. He turned and looked at me with kind of a scowl on his face, and he said, why? You don't want to sit next to me because I'm a Muslim? I didn't know he was a Muslim. I mean, now that he said it, I suppose he looked Middle Eastern, but I said, no, I'm not at all. I mean, I didn't even know you were Muslim. It's just that there are other seats available, and it's always nice to have a little bit of breathing room. And he said, you don't want to sit next to me because I'm a Muslim, don't you? And I said, and at this point now, I'm thinking to myself, this is exactly where I want to sit. I want to sit in this chair and only in this chair because I have somebody here that I can talk to. So I said, no, absolutely not. In fact, I want to sit here and talk to you. And so we did. So for the 3-hour trip, he began this 3-hour trip by telling me, first of all, he said, so are you a Christian? I said, yes. And he said, well, you know that Jesus is not God. And I said, well, you know that Jesus is God, don't you? And he said, no, he's not. And that was sort of our preamble to him giving me his explanations for why he believed that Jesus is not God. And after he got rolling for a few minutes, I said, how about this? Just put a couple of ground rules in place, if that's okay with you. I will listen attentively and with an open mind to you as you make your case for why Jesus isn't God. But more specifically, what he wanted me to listen to is his reasons for why I should become a Muslim and why Islam, in his view, is true. So I said, how about this? I will listen attentively and with an open mind to what you have to say on this topic. And all I ask is that, in half an hour or 40 minutes, whenever you're done, that you give me the same opportunity so that I can share with you why I believe that Jesus is God, why I believe in one God in three persons, the Trinity. And if you don't mind listening to me, I'd be happy to listen to you. So he said, okay. And he actually stuck by the agreement, and I listened. And I would ask a question here or there for clarification's sake, but I already knew, for the most part, the general outline of the arguments that he was making. I was already very familiar with Islam, but I didn't want to deprive him of the opportunity to sell me on this, because he wanted to sell me. He wanted me to walk off that plane 3 hours later, convinced that I should become a Muslim. Now, I disagreed with most everything he had to say, but I did admire him for getting right to the point and being willing to talk about his convictions. How many Christians do you know who are willing to do that when it comes to their own faith? So after he spoke for, half hour, 40 minutes, then it was my turn. And so then I started explaining to him why I am a follower of Jesus Christ and why I don't accept his claim that Jesus was merely a prophet, merely a really important prophet, but not God, not true God, as we Catholics believe. And I got the impression, honestly, that after I had unraveled for him and explained to him the reasons that I believe in Jesus, I got the impression that he had never heard these reasons before, because he seemed quizzical at moments, and he seemed surprised, in fact, a few times. And he asked me, so wait a minute, what do you mean by that? And then I would explain it again to make sure that he understood. So although he didn't say, well, I never knew that, I think he had never really heard the case for Christ, at least not in the way that I was explaining it to him. So here's how it ended up. We get to the airport. It's time to get off the airplane. He gives me his business card. I give him my business card. He said, there are some really good pro-Muslim videos, and I recommend that you watch these. And he wrote down a couple of titles that were on YouTube. And so we had each other's email address and such. And I said, yeah, I'd be happy to look at them. And I will send you some that I think that you should watch and listen to. He said, okay. So we parted ways, and that was that. And within a couple of days, really, maybe 2-3 days had gone by, and this gentleman emailed me, and he said, hey, do you remember me from the plane conversation? I just want to make sure that you have the link to those videos because I want to make sure that you see them. And I said, I, in fact, have already looked at one of them. Thank you for the other links here. And I said, now here is my list of videos I'd like you to see. And I sent him back, half a dozen links to videos and other resources. And then I followed up with him about a week later and asked him if he had listened to or watched some of the videos, and I never heard back from him. So I don't know how to interpret that. Maybe it meant that he did see some of these videos talking about the case for Christ, and he didn't know how to answer them, so he just didn't answer me. Or maybe he never got around to it, or maybe he never intended to watch them in the first place. I don't know, because I never heard back from him. But it was a great reminder to me that I, as the Bible says, 1 Peter 3:15, to always be ready to give a defense or an explanation, sometimes the translation says, always be ready to give an explanation to anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that is in you, but do it with gentleness and respect, which we accomplished on that plane ride. It was great because there was no interrupting, there was no anger. He might have felt a bit angry, and I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel angry at all when he was making the case for why Christianity is false and why I should become a Muslim. It didn't make me angry. If anything, it made me feel more well-informed. I already knew a lot about Islam, but this helped me clarify my thinking even more. But I didn't discern any anger on his part. But in any case, that's how it all ended up. Maybe you were hoping for a happy ending. Where he emails me and said, oh my gosh, where do I sign? I want to become a Christian because I saw these videos and I talked to you. Unfortunately, normally it doesn't work like that, at least not in my experience. But seeds were planted, and I'm hopeful that maybe at some point down the road, those seeds will be watered, and eventually maybe he will come to faith in Christ. We'll see. But the reason I mentioned this particular experience to you is because if you are open to this kind of thing, if you are keeping your antennae up, then sooner or later you're likely to come into a situation where somebody will ask you that question. Why do you believe in Jesus? And what prompted me to share this with you is a snippet from a longer interview. Joe Rogan has a podcast. I'm sure you've heard of him, very, very popular podcaster. And he was interviewing Ben Shapiro, who's one of the top people at the Daily Wire. And I really like Ben Shapiro a lot. In fact, I want my preamble to include, and I don't know if Ben Shapiro will even ever hear this, but for the record, I really like his work. He's a very sharp thinker. He's articulate, and for years now, I've really admired and followed his work, and I have high regard for the Daily Wire, et cetera, et cetera. So I just want to make sure you understand this is not coming from the standpoint of a critic. It's somebody who's very sympathetic to the project, overall at least, that Ben Shapiro is engaged in on social issues and such. So with that in mind, what I'd like you to do is listen to an exchange. Cyrus, I think this exchange is about a minute long, roughly. Is that right? Yeah, okay, it's about a minute long. And it's part of a bigger conversation in which Joe Rogan is talking to Ben Shapiro about Jesus and who does Ben Shapiro think Jesus is. It's reminiscent of Jesus saying to the apostles when he says in Matthew chapter 16, who do men say that I am? And the apostles, they stammer and stutter and they give some incorrect answers. Well, some say you're John the Baptist. Some say you're Elijah or one of the prophets. And then Jesus says again to them, well, who do you say that I am? because these men had been with him now for a couple of years, and they had seen the miracles and all these things. So Jesus is now asking them, forget about what other people are saying. What do you think about me? Who do you think that I am? And everyone else fell silent, and we're told that Simon, before his name was changed just a few moments later, he said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Bingo, bango, he gives the correct answer. Notice, interestingly, in John chapter 1, this is just for your good-to-know file, in John chapter 1, when Jesus meets Simon for the first time, because his brother Andrew brought Simon to meet Jesus, and there was another of the disciples there, Nathanael. And Nathanael says almost the same exact thing, almost exactly word for word, about Jesus being the Messiah and the Son of God. He says almost exactly the same thing that Simon says a couple of years later in Matthew chapter 16. And you'll notice in John chapter 1 that Jesus does not say to Nathanael, "Oh, okay, well, you are rock, and upon this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." In other words, it wasn't like a magic formula, like that TV show, What's My Line, where I hope I'm not getting them confused, but it was Groucho Marx, and there was a certain word that if the guest happened to say that word inadvertently, without realizing what the word was, then it would trigger, I don't know, a prize or something like that. So it wasn't as though Jesus was just waiting for somebody to say the magic words. It's like, somebody please get it right, and then I will make you the rock on which I'll build my church. No, because Nathanael said almost exactly what Simon Peter said. But when Simon Peter said this, that's when Jesus said, so Simon says to him, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And then Jesus says, "You are blessed, Simon, son of Jonah." So Simon Peter addresses Jesus, giving him a title and then his lineage. You are the Christos, you are the Messiah, the anointed one, his title. And then he says, Son of the living God, acknowledging God as his Father. And then Jesus turns around and says, "You are blessed, Simon, son of Jonah." And then from there he talks about his name change. "You are rock, and upon this rock I'll build my church." Now that's now delving into the issue of the papacy and what does that mean exactly, and what was happening with Peter and the keys and all that. So we're going to digress from that. We're going to put that off to the side, but just come back to Jesus. So here we have his followers. Even they, after about 2 years, were not entirely sure exactly who or what Jesus was. And you know, when I say was, of course, Jesus still is all of those things, but just to speak colloquially here. So with that kind of biblical precursor in mind, take a listen to this brief clip. This is from the Joe Rogan show, and he's talking with Ben Shapiro from the Daily Wire about Jesus.
You know, from a Jewish point of view, where we don't believe in the divinity of Christ, I think that there you can make an argument that the Gospels, which were written,
he was just a prophet, and
significant. No, we don't even believe he was a prophet.
What do you think he was? What do you guys think?
What do I think he was historically? I think he was a Jew who tried to lead a revolt against the Romans and got killed for his trouble, just like a lot of other Jews at that time who were crucified for trying to lead revolts against the Roman and got killed for their trouble.
So he became legend in story, and it became a bigger and bigger deal as time went on.
Yeah, he had a group of followers, and then that gradually grew, and then
do you think he was resurrected?
No, that's not a Jewish belief.
Okay, I just want to check.
Yeah, no, we're not into
You're not
we're not into miracle stories. No, that's
no?
No.
You don't have any miracles?
No, not by Jesus. Right? No? They're ones in the Old Testament. Ones? Yeah, you've got Moses splitting the sea and all that.
What do you think happened there?
What do I think happened there?
Yeah.
Well, I'll go with the Maimonidean explanation that there was. It says in the Bible there was a strong east wind. So there's a naturalistic explanation for a physical phenomenon.
Okay. And I want to say it again. I really do like Ben Shapiro a lot. And so this is what I want to say in response to this is coming from the standpoint of somebody who has dealt with these kinds of questions and objections many times over the years. So there are a few things that I'd like to just put out there because they didn't come up, at least I didn't hear them in this interview. And these are the following. Number one, I understand, of course, that Jews do not accept the divinity of Jesus. And I'm talking about Jews who identify as Jews, not as, say, Messianic Jews who are really Christian, but they have a very strong Jewish overtone to them. They observe Jewish customs and such. I'm not talking about groups like that. I'm talking about people like Ben Shapiro, who's a serious religious Jew, and he believes in the tenets of Judaism, and he practices his faith, which is more than can be said for many people. in the Jewish world, those who don't take the faith seriously. Maybe it's just a cultural phenomenon for them. But in any case, he's serious about his faith, and I admire that. But he is speaking, it sounds to me, from the standpoint of somebody who's never had the case for Christ actually explained to him. Kind of like that Muslim fellow on the airplane that I spoke to, who it seemed pretty clear he'd never heard before. So let's cycle through a couple of things that are said here. Number one, the idea that Jesus, you heard Joe Rogan say, well, he was a prophet. And he said, no, he's not a prophet. And by that, I mean that, in other words, Jews of today and from years gone by, they didn't regard Jesus to be a prophet in the way that Moses or Jeremiah or Ezekiel or Elijah were prophets speaking for God. As you heard him say that Jesus was this kind of revolutionary figure who got killed because he was trying to overthrow the Roman Empire. Now, I wish that when Joe Rogan had said the Gospels, he referred kind of obliquely to the Gospels, and I wonder if he was going to say, well, what about these eyewitness testimonies? And that got kind of cut off and they went in a different direction. But that's something that should be taken into account, is the four Gospels, specifically Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they are either eyewitness accounts in the case of Matthew and John, or they are near eyewitness accounts in the case of Mark and Luke, who were not among the 12 apostles, and they were not among the original followers of Jesus. So they gathered their information from the sources who were eyewitnesses. So this is why Luke's gospel begins with the words, you have heard from many of the eyewitnesses these things that happened with Jesus, and as a way to, verify the things that you have heard and to vouchsafe for you the truth of what you have been told about Jesus, I have decided to set everything out in an orderly sequence. In other words, I'm going to give you now a chronological overview of the life of Jesus so that you can know, most excellent Theophilus, the certainty of these things that you have been told. So there we see St. Luke saying, I wasn't an eyewitness, but I went and canvassed all the eyewitnesses I could find, and I gathered up all the information I could, and I'm now putting it together for you in this chronological system. That's how he begins his gospel. Mark also, of course, was not one of the 12 apostles either. But in any case, these are both eyewitness accounts and near eyewitness accounts that are based upon the recollections of the eyewitnesses. Now, some people would say, well, the four Gospels, that's biased because they want you to believe that Jesus is God. They want you to believe all these claims that are made subsequently about Jesus Christ, and you really shouldn't believe them because they're biased. Well, I don't think that's a valid argument, but we can, for the sake of discussion, we can put that off to the side for a little bit and then return to the Gospels. And we can point out, for example, that there were contemporary accounts from hostile third-party groups, the Jews, for example. Josephus is a prime example of somebody who was alive during the lives of the apostles, and he was a renowned Jewish historian, and he wrote prolifically on not only the history of the Jews, but their interactions with the Romans, and he was, at a certain point, he became a friend of the Romans as well. But also, he elucidated biblical incidents. So starting with the Garden of Eden, he added from Jewish oral tradition, he added more commentary to what you would find in the Old Testament to kind of expand on that. So in any case, he was not a Christian, and he would be an example of somebody, a contemporary of the apostles, who talks about Jesus. So he really did exist. We also see the pagan Roman authors, Pliny the Younger, Tacitus, others, who wrote from a more hostile position even. The Roman Empire didn't quite know what to do with these Christians because they didn't worship all the pantheon of gods from Greece and Rome, and they had this one God, and they would not budge off that one God, and they wouldn't accept anyone else, and they wouldn't offer incense. They certainly wouldn't worship Caesar. And so the Roman pagans, they were mystified. Well, who are these people? What is their deal? And lots of rumors circulated about the early Christians that they were engaged in human sacrifice. By the way, a misunderstanding of the meaning of the Mass. But interesting that was one of the charges laid against them. People said, well, they're practicing human sacrifice. And other sundry sins and infractions that they believe that the Christians were involved in. So suffice to say, without going into lots of detail right now, there's a body of evidence that does not come from the four Gospels. It does not come from the Christians of that time. It came from third-party hostile witnesses, both Jewish and pagan, who sought to thwart Christianity. They were not interested in promoting Christianity. They wanted to debunk Christianity. And yet they corroborate, unintentionally, but they corroborate certain key details of the Gospels. A, that Jesus lived at a certain time, that he lived in a certain place, that he gathered followers around him, that he was killed, as Ben Shapiro says, killed for his trouble. So certain details that are consistent with what you do read in the Gospels emerge from these third-party hostile witnesses. So what can we make of all this? What about this idea that Jesus was really just some guy with some fiery rhetoric and he had some interesting ideas, but that's all it really was? So let's analyze this. What are the possibilities here? What are the options? There were really only a few options as to evaluating who or what Jesus was. One option is he was a liar, and he was a charlatan using his high-flown rhetoric and his powers of persuasion to convince people that he was something other than what he really was. If he was a charlatan, then a few questions come up. So if Jesus really wasn't who he claimed to be, and he knew he wasn't, and he was just scamming people for whatever reason, you'd have to ask, first of all, okay, what were his reasons? What did he get from, what was he trying to get from this? So we know that time and time again, the zealots and other parties within Judaism who wanted the overthrow of the Roman occupiers, they wanted to get rid of the Romans. They wanted to get back to their own kingdom under their own Jewish rule. And time and again, they offered Jesus the opportunity to lead them in an insurrection that would do this. And Jesus swatted that down time after time. Said, no. This is not my kingdom. I'm not here to do that. This is not my reason for coming here. My reason is to reveal to you the kingdom of God. Remember when he's talking to Pilate, he's being interrogated by Pilate during the Passion, and he says, my kingdom is not of this world. So let's say he was a liar. What did he get out of it for his lie? Liars do what they do because they want something. Maybe they want to take advantage of somebody sexually. Maybe they want money. Maybe they want power and fame. There's always some gain in mind when a liar lies. Otherwise, why is he going to lie? What's in it for him, in other words? So the first question is, what was in it for Jesus? Nothing. He didn't have female groupies. He didn't have, and by that I'm not referring to the holy women who were part of the group of followers. I'm referring to, groupies, if you follow the meaning of the term. He didn't have that. He didn't seek that, and that had no place in his life. He was poor. Remember how he talked about how foxes have dens and other animals have places to sleep, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. He was an itinerant preacher. He didn't have wealth. He didn't have a fancy home. He didn't have fancy clothes. He didn't eat richly, unless I suppose he accepted a dinner invitation from one of the wealthy Pharisees. But aside from that, he ate a very poor man's food. And and there's more. This is important that we flesh out just a little bit further what some of the reasons are if you were asked why you believe in Jesus. I'm assuming you do. And if you're asked that question, what would your answer be? So we heard a brief, about a minute-long snippet of an interview that Ben Shapiro did with Joe Rogan. It was interesting to me to hear Ben speaking from his Jewish religious background about what he thought of Jesus, and he was just flatly said he wasn't God, he wasn't a prophet, he was a revolutionary who got killed for his trouble. So we're talking about what are some of the options if you're evaluating Jesus as we see him in the Gospels and as he's referred to by these hostile third-party witnesses, the Jewish writers of the first and into the second century, the pagan Roman writers of the first and into the second century, the people who lived contemporaneously at the time of the apostles, shortly after the time of Christ. They, too, corroborate some of these details. A, that Jesus did exist, and he did live in a certain place in a certain time. He did gather a very big following. In fact, Pliny the Younger, he was sent on this mission. He was the governor, I forget, Bithynia or someplace like that, and the Roman emperor put him on this job to go in amongst the Christians and take notes and find out exactly who these people were and what they were doing. So he wrote a report, and it's available in English. Just look it up on the Googles, and you'll find it. Letter from Pliny the Younger to the emperor. And in this letter, Pliny says, well, here's what I found. They don't do all these heinous things that people say they do, but they do believe in their one God, and they don't accept the gods of the Roman Empire. And he talks about how he had to torture a few people to see if he could get more detailed information. But in any case, the point is simply that you've got not just the Christian eyewitnesses in the form of the Gospels, but you also have third-party hostile groups, both Jewish and Roman, who each in their own way, to some extent, corroborate some of these details. So if Jesus were a liar, that's one option. If he was a charlatan and he really was in this for something, we would have to ask, what was he in it for? What did he get for his trouble, aside from crucifixion? Did he have women hanging all over him? No. Jesus was a celibate. Did he live large? No. Did he have a lot of bling? Did he live in a big house? Did he have lots of money? He didn't have any of those things. And liars lie to get something. Well, if it wasn't that, what was it? Okay, political power. How about that? Well, no, because not only did Jesus not wield any political power, every time his followers and other onlookers would try to foist political power upon him, he always refused it. He was not trying to lead an insurrection against the Romans. He did not seek to overthrow this foreign invasion, this rule of these pagan people over the Jews. He decidedly did not do any of those things. So why did he lie? In fact, why would a liar talk about telling the truth so much? And how interesting it is that if Jesus were in fact a liar, how do you account for the fact that a liar who's telling a lie managed to transform untold hundreds of millions of people over the last 2,000 years with his message of truth and honesty and goodness and love your neighbor? I mean, if you read the things that are attributed to Jesus in the Gospels, does that sound like a liar to you? Does it sound like the things a liar would say? No. Now, what if he wasn't lying? What if he really did believe all these things, but he was just deluded? Maybe it was a form of mental illness. Maybe he just was not all there, and he was speaking from some place in his mind that he thought was real, but it really wasn't real. He was just deranged somehow. Well, does that really track with human experience? I mean, if you're around somebody who's mentally ill, and you know it, you know that person is mentally ill. It could be schizophrenia, it could be bipolar, it could be anything. And, whether it's technically a mental illness or it's some sort of a personality disorder, whatever it may be, isn't it true that when you're around somebody like that, you're kind of on edge and you're kind of nervous because you don't know what that person might do? Could that person become violent? You have to be on your guard. And most of the time, people who are recognized as being mentally ill or having some type of personality disorder, people don't want to be around them. People get out of the way. They go the other direction. And yet, in the case of Jesus, even the third-party hostile Jewish and Roman witnesses, or those who are writing about Jesus, they too, in conjunction with those who wrote the Gospels, say that people flocked to Jesus. They wanted nothing more than to be around him, hanging on his every word, listening intently. They didn't always agree with what he said. Some people left him, but they couldn't get enough of him. And then the miracles. I mean, how do you explain the miracles? Up to and including his resurrection. Now, we'll get to the resurrection in a minute. So if Jesus were really mentally ill, how do you account for the fact that all those other people around him who were sane, I mean, they couldn't all have been mentally ill. So all these sane people who are drawn to him and whose lives are radically changed for the better as a result of his message. Is that really likely to have happened? And can we point to any other example of something like that for the good? I don't mean that, the Charles Mansons of the world and other people who are freaks and deranged in their own way, and they do manage to get a group of people to follow them, but it's always for evil purposes. There's always some nefarious aspect to that. Not so with Jesus. Now, the third option would be, maybe this was just something that got out of control. Maybe Jesus had a few great ideas and he wasn't really seeking to do anything. He wound up getting crucified, but it was those disciples, those pesky apostles. Those were the guys who were the charlatans because they saw something good and they ran with it. And they decided to blow this whole thing up out of proportion and turn Jesus into a god and make a whole big thing out of what wasn't really there in the first place, and they got away with it. And we call that Christianity. Maybe that's what happened. All right, well, let's apply some of the same questions to the apostles. What did they get out of it? If they were liars, if they knew that Jesus wasn't really who he claimed to be, God, if they knew he didn't really do these miracles, he didn't really cure people of blindness and lameness, and he didn't stop a woman's continuing hemorrhage instantaneously. He didn't raise people from the dead. He didn't control the weather. He didn't stop a storm in its tracks when all the people on the boat thought they were going to drown. He never really did any of those things. First of all, you're going to have to convince all the other people who lived in that area at that time that Jesus did do these things. And they would say, well, when? I never saw him do any of these things. I never saw that. You'd have to account for that somehow. But what about his resurrection, the greatest of all the miracles, where Jesus, or so we're told, and I do believe it, by the way, but those who are skeptical will say, well, that's just what you were told. But Jesus said that he would die, he would be crucified, and on the third day he would rise from the dead, and he did. In fact, if you were one of these scurrilous, unscrupulous apostles who were trying to pull the wool over the people and convince them that Jesus actually rose from the dead, why would you put into the gospel itself this idea that maybe you were going to scam people and pretend that Jesus rose from the dead when he didn't really rise from the dead? They actually put that into the gospels. Read Matthew's gospel, and you'll see that this is part of their narrative, is that people, and by this I'm referring to the Jewish authorities, they thought that the apostles were up to something and that they would steal the body if they had a chance to, and then they would claim that Jesus rose from the dead because, look, there's no body in the tomb. That's why this is why the Jews asked for a detachment of Roman guards to be placed at the doorway of the tomb to prevent any such thing from happening. So if you were one of these apostles who were supposedly scamming people with this myth about Jesus rising from the dead, why would you include that detail in your gospel account? I mean, you'd think you would want to hide that kind of thing, wouldn't you? To throw the authorities off the trail. Anyway, so that's in there. What did they get out of this? What did the apostles gain from going around telling people, hey, Jesus, remember that guy? He rose from the dead. Not to mention that there are incidents recorded in which, in some cases, upwards of 500 people saw Jesus after the resurrection, bodily resurrected. It wasn't just this spiritual or symbolic resurrection. Jesus truly rose from the dead, and they saw him and talked to him and ate with him and touched him. He wasn't a ghost, as Jesus himself said. So what did they get out of that? What could they possibly get? Well, women, no, because the apostles preached the gospel of chastity and purity, and they extolled marriage for its own sake, and any number of them were celibate, St. Paul included. So they didn't have women in their lives in that sense of conjugal relations, or for that matter, other kinds of relations. They didn't have that. They didn't do that. All right, was it money? No. The apostles, at least in the beginning, they gave the money to the poor. They collected it from the other Christians. They gathered it in common. They shared it with the poor. They were all about helping the poor and the people who were homeless and widowed and such. So they were not rolling in dough. And whatever dough they did have, they distributed it among the needy. So it wasn't sex. It wasn't money. All right, what else? What are the other options? Okay, power, maybe? Political power, perhaps? They didn't have any of that. In fact, the apostles were hunted like animals, and one by one, they were all killed in very painful ways. I forget which one. It was a St. Bartholomew. I forget which one. He was flayed alive, and I'm sure you know that means that you had your skin peeled off you. If you're flayed, your skin is peeled off your body. I'm going to stop there. So they met grisly, painful executions, every one of them. St. John suffered the pains of these executions, although they never could quite kill him, so he died of natural causes. He was the last apostle to die. So what did they gain for all their trouble? Nothing. At least nothing in the worldly sense. So you'd have to say, were they crazy? Were they liars? Or is it possible, this is the other option, is it possible that maybe, just maybe, Jesus Christ is who he claimed to be, that he was God? And the miracles attested to this, and the teachings that were profound and life-changing attested to this. And the fact that those who saw that he had indeed risen from the dead, including his 12 apostles, They were so overcome by the power of it that they needed to tell everybody possible about Jesus and his message. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And the gospel of salvation. For God so loved the world, Jesus says in John chapter 3, verse 16, that he sent his only son. For God so loved the world that he sent his only son, that whoever would believe in him would not perish, but have eternal life. You've got bad news and good news. Bad news, you guys are in sin. Good news, I'm here to help you. Be like if you're in a burning building on the 10th floor, and suddenly the window crashes in and there's a fireman on a ladder telling you, I can save you. Come out of this burning building. Get down on this ladder. Get on this ladder with me, and I will save you from this burning building. And you have a choice to make. Are you going to stay in the burning building and go up and smoke, or are you going to go with the fireman who can save you? I'm going to go with the fireman. So there's so much more to say, and I've already taken the better part of 40 minutes in saying it, but it's worth your time. Trust me on this. It's worth your time to reflect on these issues, to think about them, and then when a question like this comes up, you're going to be in a better position to offer some thoughts, to say it's reasonable to believe in Jesus. In fact, it's more than reasonable. It's compelling once you know the reasons behind our belief in Jesus. And I've only given you a smattering of them.
For more of The Patrick Madrid Show, visit relevantradio.com/Patrick.